So we speak about regulations a lot here on the channel when it comes to safety, when it comes to the production of cars, when it comes to how many electric vehicles are being made for manufacturers. It's a very, very controversial issue, both in the UK where I am and in the US where Ed is, and I'm sure it's the case for a lot of other countries as well. But a lot of people do want to get rid of these regulations. A lot of people think that they are just a bit unnecessary, that there's a lot of government overreach, a bit of micromanaging when it comes to that sort of things. They shouldn't really get involved in this. But Ed, these regulations are there for a reason. And especially if you look back at the history of the automotive industry, where we were not even 100 years ago, 60 or so years ago, things have gone on leaps and bounds, not least with things as basic as nowadays as a seatbelt.
Yeah, and you said the word micromanaging, and I think that's what industry is going to say. There's like a tension, right? The government is looking out for the public interest, public safety, cleaner air, whatever it might be, and then you've got the car manufacturers that want profit and they want the freedom to innovate or do whatever they want, and those two things collide, and so sometimes the government has to step in. And is it for the good or not? It's hard to say. But let's take a look. And it's been happening. Can it happen without the government pushing the car manufacturers? That's probably a good question. And early on, I would say, let's say prior to the 60s, there were innovations in the 30s that were safety glass. Ford put it on all their cars. Padded dashes. Dashes used to be made like solid, steel. Not so good. But even in the 40s, padded dashes had come out. The first seat belts were in the 50s. Volvo had a three-point lap belt that was standard, I think, in the late 50s. But Ford tried to market in the mid 50s, market this thing called the lifeguard safety package. I never heard of this thing, lifeguard safety package, which was really a padded dashboard and seat belts, recessed steering wheel, so a collapsible steering wheel, that kind of thing. And no government mandates at the time, but nobody wanted to pay for it. So the result was it didn't go anywhere. So without a government mandate, people say, I'm not going to be in an accident. Why do I need those seat belts? It takes me 3 seconds to put it on. And I think that's the way people were thinking, back in the 50s and before.
Yeah, it's certainly moved on a lot since then, and these kind of regulations are there for a reason. I mean, I wasn't aware of that from Ford in the 50s before we went through it before we started recording, but it's incredible to see that no one really wanted that increased safety. It does need because the average consumer, you have to put. I mean, it might seem a bit obvious nowadays, but you have to put yourself back in that time. The average consumer won't really know how much of an impact that's had because there's never been a thing like that before. And if you're saying, oh well, this is costing more, and it's something that you're struggling to afford anyway, maybe a lot of people would not go with it, and it was reflected in the lack of sales really when it comes to that. But when it comes to safety, things did change in the 60s eventually for the better.
Yeah, and surprisingly, the thing that pushed it over the edge was a book written by a consumer advocate, Ralph Nader. So you might want to look up this book. It's called Unsafe at Any Speed, and it's about the Chevrolet Corvair. The Corvair is a convertible rear engine car. So the fact that it was rear engine and the suspension was a little crazy, I guess, not well designed, caused it to be prone to rollovers, had no seat belts or any of that kind of thing. And so they pushed this car out. And basically, Ralph Nader's point was the people in the automotive industry that they don't really care about the driver. They just care about making money and all that. And I guess that book had quite an impact. And as a result, in the mid 60s, the US government created the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. And they are the ones now that pretty much shifted the driver, if you want to use that word, for making cars safer, making emissions better, shifted that responsibility from the automakers into the government. So things like controls and displays, braking systems, but mostly like seat belts, side impact. Those side impact crashes you see, those didn't used to exist. Very important thing for a car to be able to pass that rollover, crash resistance, that kind of thing. and even things for after crashes, like ability of fuel systems not to become flammable and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think the accountability or and the shaming, for lack of a better term, I think that is really key in making car manufacturers kind of sit up and like, oh, we need to do something about this. I mean, just to put it into a UK or a European perspective, I mean, 20, 25 years ago or so, it might be longer actually, they introduced something called the NCAP rating here in Europe, and it basically said gave you a star rating for your vehicle, how safe it was. It'd go through all these tests and everything like that, which of course have been refined over the decades. But it'd give you a safety rating for your vehicle. And when it was first introduced, I don't think any cars really got a 5 star, maybe a Volvo or something like that. But the vast majority get 3, 4, 2 stars in some cases. And those manufacturers that didn't innovate and improve their safety, they were basically named and shamed. All these vehicles had to display it like it's a 2 star or a 3 star or whatever, a bit like you might see with Food Standard Agency here in the UK, for example. Any kind of restaurant, any kind of takeaway, they have to have this thing displayed saying how hygienic they are. And the same thing happened with cars, and it made them sit up. And nowadays, what's happened? Well, pretty much every single vehicle sold in Europe is a 5 star rating. Every single one of them. If you don't get a 5 star NCAP now, forget about it. You need to go back and redesign the thing because no one's going to buy it. And ultimately, people will vote with their wallets. But if they're not made aware of stuff, then manufacturers potentially could just keep getting away with what they're doing.
Yeah, and you know that beeping sound you get when one of the passengers in your car hasn't put the seatbelt on. I don't
Hmm.
know. At first, when that came out, people said, I gotta figure out how to disconnect that beeper thing." But now, over time, right, you say, "Hey, put your seatbelt on." So in a way, we take all that for granted now. And it's amazing how many things over the last 30, 40, even 50 years that have gone into cars. So obviously seat belts, head restraints,
Mm.
that came in right away. So they protect you against whiplash when you have an accident. Airbags, the one on the steering wheel on the sides. Even though seatbelts were required in the 60s in the US, it took until the 80s for laws where you'd get a ticket or a fine if you weren't wearing them. Since the 2000s, things that like backup cameras, tire pressure monitoring systems. If you drive with your tires at 5 psi, and you go into a high-speed turn or something, it chances are, I mean, this doesn't force you to go put air in your tires, but at least it lets you know that you could be in danger. So, and even more recently, automatic lane departure warnings, lane keep assist, all these other kinds of things, and not to mention like everything on the emission side.
Yeah.
So the Clean Air Act in the United States was in 1970, so it's quite a long time ago, but it's probably done quite a bit to clean up the air, and certainly the fuel economy standards as well sort of work hand in hand together. Those probably have, I mean, in the end, by making cars more fuel efficient, not only do you clean up the air, but you probably save people a ton of money, at
Oh,
least
yeah.
in what they have to spend from day to day. And that's all, again, you got to give credit to the government for sort of giving that little push to the car makers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it like anything, it's a controversial issue, but there are some things that they've done that are undoubtedly a good thing. Removing lead from petrol, from gas, that has been a good thing. That has reduced the amounts of the rates of asthma and breathing diseases in urban areas exponentially. Making a change like that, and yeah, making the air cleaner. I mean, people forget, people don't know because they either weren't around or haven't researched it or whatever, but in the US smog and stuff was a huge problem. Same here in the UK. I'm from a city called Sheffield originally, and that was the most polluted city in the world, not in Europe, not in the Western world, in the entire world in the 1960s. Those scenes that you see nowadays in places like China, that was Europe. That was in a lot of big cities in Europe because of the heavy industry there. And bringing these regulations in when it comes to emission standards, yeah, it makes the price that you pay at the petrol station, the gas station more, but it also effectively makes shows that the cars are going to be more fuel efficient because otherwise the manufacturers never would have reduced the size of engines. I mean, you look at the big block V8s from back in the day, those 6, 7, 8 liter V8 engines. You couldn't have that now on a regular car. No one would be able to afford it because the road tax and the overall cost, and even if it somehow passes the emission test, it just make it impossible. So some people out there might be annoyed at it, but you're breathing in air that's a lot cleaner now. in general because of it.
I always remember watching this little video on YouTube during COVID, and this person was in India and within viewing sight of the Himalayas, but he'd never seen them until
Oh,
COVID.
wow.
There were no cars on the street, and he woke up one morning and said, "Hey, look, there's mountains over there." Can you imagine if there weren't regulations like this? I know, like in Los Angeles, the smog used to be horrendous. I mean, it was
Mm.
known for smog. So in the end, it benefits do come. They don't come right away, but before they come and before these things can even be put in place, the car companies aren't going to just sit back and be pushed around, or as you say, George, micromanaged by the government. And they've got every excuse they can come up with. And technical, it's not feasible. Too hard to make. No way we could do that. Cost too much. You're going to lose jobs. Leave me alone. I know what I'm doing, right? That kind of thing. And and all this is really driven by profit in the end, right? They want to keep manufacturing costs down. They want to keep profit margins up, keep those sales up. And then there's also, like you said, the design freedom. And the Corvair is an example. They were putting aesthetics. Oh, let's make a cool rear wheel drive car in a world where there aren't any a rear engine car in a world at the time there weren't any cars like that were on the road. So aesthetics were over safety, and then sometimes they'll even pull the thing is, oh, well, if you force us to do that, it'll put us at a disadvantage because they don't have those rules in Asian or European cars or whatever it might be. And this happened with seatbelts. It happened with it took, airbags were fought for decades and decades here in the States. And certainly the emission standards. When the emission standards first came out, there were claims that the automotive industry would be shut down. Shut down. So, hey, that's those are the excuses that are used. So these things don't happen overnight, right? You have to, are they legitimate or are they not? And there's probably some legitimacy to some of that, but for the most part, you know, so sometimes profit motive is not what's best for everyone.
No, it's usually just best for the people, the shareholders, the board members, all those kinds of people, the workers of those companies. Admittedly, that should kind of trickle down to them in form of bonuses and pay rises. In theory, of course, I mean, no, it's not that simple, obviously, but it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like the design of cars. People always say, "Oh, cars nowadays are ugly," and yeah, to be honest, some of them are absolutely, but they are designed that way to be safe, not only for the passenger, but also the people, the potential pedestrians and stuff like that, people in other cars. I mean, yeah, the incredible fins and wings and stuff like we used to see back in the 50s and 60s, they look absolutely beautiful. But what if that person runs off onto the pavement, onto the sidewalk? It's going to be a horrendous accident because you've got effectively a big knife almost at that point. It's doesn't really bear thinking about. There's a reason why they don't do that anymore. And like you say, the softer interiors, ones that are better for crash structures. Yeah, having all these really cool chrome steel buttons and things like that. It looks
But good.
beautiful. But if you're in a crash and you're heading towards it, your forehead's going towards one of those buttons. It's not going to be very pretty for sure. So, it might look a bit soulless, it might be a bit boring, but it means more people survive, which is more important than anything, of course.
Yeah, and they can make all these excuses and everything, but in the end, then they have to actually do something to try and stop the government. And one of the things, well, maybe we could just delay it. Or, of course, in the United States, there's a significant amount of money in politics and lobbying and that kind of thing, and lawsuits. But sometimes the driver and the consumer is blamed. In fact, in they said, oh, the Corvair. Well, there's nothing wrong with the Corvair. People just don't know how to drive it. So what Ralph Nader was calling the illusion of control. They try and make an illusion that, oh, the car's fine. It's really the driver. So they sometimes there is that shift. But I think overall, if you look at the cost it takes to put some of these things into cars, it's probably once we get used to it and everyone's forced to do it, all the car makers are forced to do it, the competition thing goes out the window because they ought to figure out the most cost-effective way to do it. The amount of cost for these things is in the hundreds, rarely even in the thousands to implement them. And, seat belts have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The estimate
Mm.
is 375,000 between when they were introduced in 2017 airbags probably even more. We talked about reducing smog and of course that's got to have all sorts of health benefits and even things like, backup cameras and that kind of thing, keeping you from going over a cliff or who knows what it might be. So there's probably a lot of things like one that surprised me was electronic stability control, which is now required in the United States. And that electronic stability control is when you can't control your car anymore. And by having the car step in, it's actually had a significant impact on single car accidents. So when you're just driving by yourself. So overall, we take all the benefits for granted. Sort of like in racing. Like in racing, it used to be that it was accepted. I know at the Indianapolis 500, it's like, oh man, how many died this year? It was, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, maybe to some extent the early 70s, but now we feel pretty safe in our cars. And especially with a lot of this lane keep assist and helping you, change lanes and all that, making sure those little lights that are on your rear view mirror that say, hey, there's somebody in your blind spot, don't move over now. All those things go a long way in helping people. And many of those, if not most of those, came from forced regulation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's only when you go back, like you said with motorsport as well, it's only when you go back and, step into a car that's 20, 30 years old that you realize how far we've come. You feel exposed in those cars because, yeah, they're more nimble, they're smaller, but they don't have a lot of the safety features that we have now. The cars nowadays are huge relatively, of course, but that's not without good reason. So, yeah, there's definitely things that for me are pretty much inarguable when it comes to the benefits of modern safety and the regulations that are there to uphold them. Something that is a lot more controversial, though, and this is controversial in the UK, in the US, and again, probably a lot of other countries as well, is when it comes to things like ZEV, the zero emission vehicles that I know we both really want to chat about. I've spoke about it a lot. Ed's laughing because he's probably seen a lot of the discourse when it comes to this. I mean, it seems almost like there's a civil war going on right now in the States between the
Well,
central
more
government.
political than technical.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly, exactly. Seems like there's a civil war going on right now between the central government in Washington and what California are wanting to do. There's lawsuits flying around, threats flying around. I mean, we're not going to get into the weeds too much on what's been said and done with that, but what do you think about all this, Ed? And can you kind of explain what the kind of the feeling is really when it comes to this? Because it's like Vincent Vega in Pulp Fiction. You got to have an opinion. You've got to have an opinion on this because everybody's got one.
Well, in a way, it's an extension of the Clean Air Act from, 50 years ago that we want to keep. I want to see the Himalayas if I'm living in India, right? Right. So we want to make the air cleaner. Now the question is, how do you get there? And so if you look a little bit of detail on what the mandates are, it says that you certain percentage by 2030, or even in California by 2035, which is 100% of the vehicles have to be zero emission vehicles, ZEVs, right? Zero emission. So what is a zero emission vehicle? It basically has no tailpipe emissions. Now, in some way, you want to have zero emission, net zero. Like, so an e-fuel internal combustion engine car where you scrub carbon out of the air and use electrolysis or whatever it is to get the hydrogen and you make a carbon neutral fuel, that should qualify. Why not? It's zero emissions, it's net zero, but yet under a ZEV rule that wouldn't make it. So it might be saying like, hey, it should be carbon neutral. It's different than saying zero tailpipe emissions, that kind of thing. And it really brings up the question as to what makes the government expert in telling. I'm going to take the other side of the coin here for a second. All right, now suddenly the government is the technical expert. And I thought this was sort of interesting. I said, well, how do they become technical experts to make the rules that are going to change the cars that we drive? And it turns out there are procedures that they use, like public comment periods. Sometimes they have hearings and meetings with executives, whatever it might be. They create advisory boards. They do requests for information, things like that, bring in experts to consult them. And I think a great example of this is with autonomous cars. In the US here, several states, California, I think Arizona, New Mexico, and more every day start popping up, have made state regulations for autonomous vehicles, but the federal government sort of sitting back a little bit, and they haven't really done anything, including the previous and the current administrations. And I think what they're doing is they're saying, hey, let's see how this thing plays out before we go there and start making rules that don't make sense. So I think there are some checks there, but overall, I think to answer your question, I think it's good that we're moving in that direction. I think we should be careful not to constrain and micromanage the innovation that car companies can do to achieve those goals.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated issue, and there's no easy side to it all. There's benefits and negatives on both of them. I know here in the UK, again, we've got our own ZEV mandate where a certain amount of a certain percentage of automakers have to make a certain percentage of ZEV vehicles every year, and that increases all the way till 2035 when they are meant to be, I think, 100% zero emission vehicles by that point. And we've already seen that manufacturers either can't or won't. I mean, you can debate whether they're doing it deliberately or not, just taking the fine, but they have not met the regulations last year, and they're probably not going to meet them this year. And I know that the companies have been trying to lobby the government, trying to persuade the government, need to adjust these forecasts because it's just not feasible. But then some people might argue, well, they're just saying that because they want an easier time. They don't want to, adapt this quickly. They want to push, they kick the can down the road effectively, deal with it in 5 years, deal with it in 10 years. It's the next generation's problem. And I get both sides of the argument there. I mean, Ford, for example, were fined, I think, £100 million last year for not producing enough zero emission vehicles. And there's going to be more that get fined anyway.
Yeah,
So,
and the Volkswagen thing, I know.
oh, the diesel emissions. Oh, God.
Yeah, messing with the numbers a little bit, if you want to call it that, it's probably being generous.
Yeah, yeah.
So, hey, it's cat and mouse game, right? So they're going
It
to try
is.
every trick that they can. But I think generally the regulations move us in the right direction. And you mentioned motorsports earlier. I mean, and especially from a safety standpoint, you know, regulations for helmets, fire suits, multi-point harnesses, the Hans device, head restraints, all that, the monocoque and the halo, all those
Hmm.
things were forced upon the racing teams. I'm sure there was some resistance on that. You know, not everyone is happy about decisions that the FIA makes, but in this case, making cars safer was actually good. And it's more than just cars, track design too, or safety cars, virtual safety cars, that kind of thing, all help to make racing safety safer. And then also on the environmental side, the hybrids, net zero by 2030, sustainable fuels, which will now be part of most of the FIA series by 2020, by next year, actually. Yeah. So those were all changes that have impacted, the spectacle of racing, what we see. And there's even other rules in racing, like cost caps, things that try and, level the playing field for everyone. So you need in some cases, you can't just let the spirit of competition and making money and attracting sponsors override keeping things safe, and even making sure that it's an entertaining sport. Like the 2022 rules did a lot to make it, a bit easier to pass by, reducing that turbulence behind the car. So, hey, no, in the end, most of us probably don't like too many regulations, but then we appreciate it when they do good things. And that's probably, I think, probably a good summary for what's happened with cars. So regulation's good, but just got to be a little careful how you implement it. And hopefully, right, if the government does listen to the OEMs and the manufacturers at the FIA, and they do work closely with the teams, the regulations that come out aren't too bad, and especially if they're willing to change them if things don't work out.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we'll see what happens when it comes to cars and stuff on this. I'm sure it's going to evolve. It's going to rumble on in terms of all the opinions about it and everything. But get yours in the comments below, guys. If you enjoyed this discussion, really would appreciate it. And just yeah, are governments overreaching? Are they micromanaging, to use that phrase again, when it comes to how these cars are manufactured, what kinds of cars are manufactured? Are they going too far with this? Yes, it was fine in the past, but now it's a bit too much. Or do you think that the manufacturers have to be told what to do, or they'll never do what they should be doing? Or another opinion I hear a lot, and I think it's credible, but it's a big gamble effectively. Is our renewable fuels, are they going to be allowing us to have, internal combustion engine cars anyway? So all this stuff with electric vehicles is useless because as we've covered here on the channel, electric vehicles are not perfect either. They might be classed as ZEV vehicles, but to make them does produce carbon dioxide, it does produce fossil fuels. And that's before we even get into the issue of how they get cobalt to make the batteries, which again is a whole can of worms, to put it very lightly, as well on top of that.
Yeah, and let's throw AI and autonomous cars in there. I mean, we see a lot of talk about autonomous cars, but they're not in every city and they're not a common part of our lives yet. Hey, wait till they do become that, and then there's artificial intelligence that's in the cars and running them, and what kind of regulations do you need on that when and AI is something that changes on a weekly basis. So I think it's going to be hard for regulations to keep up with that. They run at a decade's pace, not a weekly pace. So it'd be interesting to hear what people think about what regulations we're going to need in the future because the automotive industry is at a turning point here with AI and autonomy and all that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that's all. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that needs to be regulated and to what extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a little preview to our next chat. I'm sure that's a very big discussion that I like talking about. Things like Tesla's robo taxis, about services like Waymo over in the US and stuff like that. Again, another controversial issue, but I'm sure we will cover it in depth for you guys very soon. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening or watching to this discussion with Ed. Thanks for joining us on this, Ed. Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, George, and look forward to our next discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And if you have any topics for discussion as well to suggest, let us know in the comments below, guys. Really do appreciate it as always. And yeah, have a fantastic day wherever you're in the world today. And yeah, the basics that if you get in a car later today, the very basics like seatbelts were not basics not that long ago. So don't take them for granted. They are there for a very good reason.
You will feel safer on your next drive and know why. See you later, George.
See you later, Ed.